Searchers after horror on strange, far places. For them are the catacombs of Polmaeus, the carven mausolea, the nightmare country. They climb to the moonlit towers of ruined Rhine castles and falter down black cobwebbed steps beneath the scattered stones of forgotten cities. The haunted wood, the desolate mountain are their shrines. They linger around sinister monoliths of uninhabited islands. But the true epicure is the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end, justification of existence. Esteems most of all ancient, lonely farmhouses of backwoods England, for there are dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combined to form the perfection, the hideous, most horrible of all sights are the little unpainted wooden houses, remote from traveled ways, usually squatted upon some damp grassy slope, or leaning against some gigantic outcropping of rock. 200 years and more they have leaned or squatted there, while the vines have crawled and the trees have swelled and spread. They are almost hidden now in lawless luxuriance of green and guardian shrouds of shadow, but the small pane windows still stare shockingly, as if blinking through a lethal stupor which wards off madness by dulling the memory of unutterable things. Such houses dwelt generations of strange people, whose like the world has never seen, seized with a gloomy and fanatical belief which exiled them from their kind. Their ancestors sought the wilderness freedom. There the scions of a conquering race indeed flourished, free from the restrictions of their fellows, but cowered in an appalling slavery, the dismal phantasms of their own mind. Divorced from the enlightenment of civilization, the strength of these Puritans turned into singular channels, and in their isolation, morbid self-repression, and struggle for life with relentless nature, there came to them dark, furtive traits from the prehistoric depths of the cold northern heritage. By necessity, practical, and by philosophy stern, these folks were not beautiful in their sins, erring as all mortals must. They were forced by their rigid code to seek concealment above all else, so that they came to use less and less taste in what they concealed. Only the silent, sleepy, staring houses in the backwoods can tell us what has lain hidden since the early days. They are not communicative, being loathed to shake off the drowsiness which helps them forget. Sometimes one feels that it would be merciful to tear down these houses, for they must often dream. It was to a battered edifice of a description that I was driven one afternoon in November 1896, by a rain of such chilling copiousness that any shelter was preferable to exposure. I had been traveling for some time amongst the people of the Miskatonic Valley in quest of certain geological data, and from the remote, devious, and problematic nature of my course, had deemed it convenient to employ a bicycle, despite the lateness of the season. Now I found myself upon an apparently abandoned road, which I had chosen as the shortest cut to Arkham. Overtaken by the storm at the point far from any town, and confronted with no refuge save the antique and repellent wood buildings which blinked with bleared windows from between two huge, leafless elms near the foot of the rocky hill. Distant though it is from the remnant of the road, this house nonetheless impressed me unfavorably the very moment I espied it. Honest, wholesome structures do not stare at travelers so slyly and hauntingly, and in my genealogical research I had encountered legends of a century before which biased me against places of this kind. Yet the force of the elements were such as to overcome my scruples, and I did not hesitate to wheel my machine up the weedy rise to the closed door, which seemed at once so suggestive and secretive. I had somehow taken it for granted that the house was abandoned, yet as I approached it, I was not so sure. For though the walk were indeed overgrown with weeds, they seemed to retain their nature a little too well to argue complete desertion. Therefore, instead of trying the door, I knocked, feeling as I did so a trepidation I could scarcely explain. As I waited on the rough, mossy rock, which served as a doorstep, I glanced at the neighboring house and the panes of the transom above me, and noticed that although old, rattling, and almost opaque with dirt, they were not broken. The building, then, must still be inhabited, despite its isolation and general neglect. However, my rapping evoked no response, so after repeating the summons, I tried the rusty latch, found the door unfastened. Inside was a little vestibule with walls from which the plaster was falling. Through the doorway came a faint but hateful odor. I entered, carrying my bicycle, closed the door behind me. Ahead rose a narrow staircase, flanked by a small door probably leading to the cellar, while to the left and the right were closed doors leading to rooms on the floor. Leaning my cycle against the wall, I opened the door to the left, crossed into a small, low-ceilinged chamber, but dimly lit by its two dusty windows, and furnished the barest and most primitive possible way. It appeared to be a kind of sitting room, for it had a table and several chairs, and an immense fireplace above, which ticked an antique clock on the mantel. Books and papers were very few, and in the prevailing gloom I could not readily discern the titles. What interested me most was the uniform air as displayed in every visible detail. Most of the houses in the region I had found rich with relics of the past, but here the antiquity was curiously complete, for in all the room I could not discover a single article a definitely post-revolutionary date. Had the furnishings been less humble, this place would have been a collector's paradise. As I surveyed this quaint apartment, I felt an increase in that aversion first excited by the bleak exterior of this house. Just what it was that I feared or loathed, I could by no means define, but something in the whole atmosphere seemed redolent of unhallowed age, of unpleasant crudeness, and of secrets that should be forgotten. I felt disinclined to sit down, and wandered about examining the various articles which I had noticed. The first object of my curiosities was a book, medium-sized, lying upon the table, and presenting such an aspect that I marveled at beholding it outside a museum or library. It was bound in leather with metal fittings. It was in an excellent state of preservation, being altogether an unusual sort of volume to encounter in an abode so lowly. When I opened it to the title page, my wonder grew even greater, for it proved to be nothing less than a rare Pigafetta's account of the Congo region, written in Latin from the notes of the sailor Lopex and printed in Frankfurt in 1598. I had often heard of this work, with its curious illustrations by the brothers de Bry. Hence, for a moment, forgot my uneasiness and my desire to turn the pages before me. The engravings were indeed interesting, drawn wholly from imagination careless descriptions, and represented with white skins and Caucasian features. Had not an exceedingly trivial circumstance upset my tired nerves and revived my sensation of disquiet. What annoyed me was merely the persistent way in which the volume tended to fall open of itself at plate 12, which represented in gruesome detail a butcher shop of the cannibal Anziques. I experienced some shame at my susceptibility to such a slight a thing, but the drawings nevertheless disturbed me, especially in connection with some adjacent passages descriptive of Anzique gastronomy. I had turned to a neighboring shelf and was examining its meager literary contents. An 18th century Bible, a Pilgrim's Progress of like period, illustrated with grotesque woodcuts and printed by almanac maker Isaiah Thomas, the Rotting Book of Carlton Matthews, and a few other books of evidently equal age, when my attention was aroused by an unmistakable sound of walking in the room overhead. At first astonished and startled, considering the lack of response I had to my recent knocking at the door, I immediately afterward concluded that the walker had just awakened from a sound sleep, and listened with less surprise as the footsteps sounded on the creaking stairs. The tread was heavy, yet seemed to contain a curious quality of cautiousness, the quality which I disliked the more because the tread was heavy. When I had entered the room, I had shut the door behind me. Now, after a moment of silence, during which the walker may have been inspecting my bicycle in the hall, I heard a fumbling at the latch and saw the panel portal swing open again. In the doorway stood a person of such singular appearance that I should have exclaimed aloud, but the restraints of the good breedings. Old, white beard, and ragged, my host possessed countenance and physique which inspired equal wonder and respect. His height would not have been less than 6 feet, and despite a general air of age and poverty, he was stout and powerful in proportion. His face was almost hidden by a long beard which grew high on the neck, seemed abnormally ruddy and less wrinkled than one might expect, while over his high forehead fell a shock of white hair, thinned by the years. His blue eyes, though a trifle bloodshot, seemed inexplicably keen and burning. But for his horrible unkemptness, the man would have been as distinguished-looking as he was impressive. This unkemptness, however, made him offensive despite his face and figure. Of what his clothing consisted I could hardly tell, for it seemed to me no more than a mass of tatters surmounting a pair of high, heavy boots, and his lack of cleanliness surpassed description. The appearance of the man and the instinctive fear he inspired prepared me for something like enmity, so that I almost shuddered through surprise and had a sense of uncanny incongruity when he motioned me to a chair and addressed me in a thin, weak voice, full of fawning respect and ingratiating hospitality. His speech was very curious, an extreme form of Yankee dialect I had thought long extinct. I studied it closely as he sat down opposite for conversation. "Catched in the rain, be ye?" greeted. "Glad ye was nigh, and the housin' had the sense to come right in. I calked I was asleep, else I'd heed ye. Ain't as young as I used to be, and they are a powerful sight o' naps nowadays. Travelin' fur? Ain't seed many folks run the road since the tuck of the Arkham stage." I replied that I was going to Arkham, and apologized for my rude entry into his domicile, upon he continued, "Glad to see ye, young sir. New faces is scarce round here, and I ain't had got much to cheer me up these days. Guess ye hail from Boston, don't ye? I never been there, but I can tell a town man when I see him. We had one for deer-stricken schoolmaster for '84, but he quit sudden, and no one ever heard on him since." Here the old man lapsed into a kind chuckle, and made no explanation when I questioned him. He seemed to be in an abundantly good humor, yet to possess the eccentricities which one might guess from his grooming. For some time he rambled on with an almost feverish geniality, when it struck me to ask him how he came by such a rare book. The effect of this volume had not left me. I felt a certain hesitancy of speaking of it, but curiosity outmastered all the vague fears which had steadily accumulated since my first glimpse of the house. To my relief, the question did not seem an awkward one, for the old man answered freely and volubly. "Oh, the Afrique book? Captain Ebenezer Holt traded it to me in '68, him as was killed in the war." Something about the name Ebenezer Holt caused me to look up sharply. I had encountered it in my genealogical work, but not in any records since the Revolution. I wondered if my host could help me in the task at which I was laboring, and resolve as I asked him about it later on. He continued, "Ebenezer was on a Salem merchantman for years, and picked up a sight of old queer stuff in every port. He got this in London, I guess. He ooster liked to buy things at the shops. I was up at the house on a hill trading horses when I see this book. I realized the pictures, so he gave it to me in one swap. It's a good book. Here, let me get you on my spectacles." The old man fumbled among his rags, producing a pair of dirty and amazingly antique glasses with small octangle lenses and steel bows. Donning these, he reached for the volume at the table and turned the pages lovingly. "Ebenezer could read a little of this. It's Latin, but I can't. I had 2 or 3 schoolmates read me a bit, and Passing Clark. Him they say got drowned in the pond. Can you make anything out of it?" I told him I could, and translated for the benefit of a paragraph near the beginning. If I erred, he was not scholar enough to correct me, but he seemed childishly pleased at my English version. His proximity was becoming rather obnoxious, yet I saw no way to escape without offending him. I was amused at his childish fondness of an ignorant man for the pictures of the book he could not read, and wondered how much better he could read in a few books of English which adorn the room. This revelation of simplicity removed much of my ill-defined apprehension that I felt, and I smiled as my host rambled on. "How pictures can set a body thinking. Take this on here, near the front. Hey, y'all ever seen trees like that? Big leaves a-flopping over the down? And them men, I guess, even if they be in Afrique, some of these old critters look like monkeys and half men, but I never heard no nothing like this," as he pointed to the fabulous creatures of the artist, which one might be described as a sort of dragon with the head of an alligator. The old man's speech grew a trifle thicker, and his eyes assumed a brighter glow, but his fumbling hands, though seemingly clumsier than before, were entirely adequate to their mission. The book fell open, almost of its own accord, and as if it was frequent consultation of this place, to the repellent 12th plate, showing the butcher shop amongst the cannibals. My sense of restlessness returned, though I did not exhibit it. The especially bizarre thing was that the artist had made his Africans look like white men. The limbs and the quarters hanging in the walls of the shop were ghastly, while the butcher and his axe were hideously incongruous. But my host seemed to relish the view as much as I disliked it. As the man mumbled on in his shocking ecstasy of expression on his hairy spectacled face became indescribable, but his voice sank rather than mounted. My own sensations can scarcely be recorded. All that terror I had dimly felt before rushed upon me actively and vividly, and I knew that I loathed the ancient and abhorrent creature so near me with an infinite intensity. His madness, or at least his partial perversion, seemed beyond dispute. He was almost whispering now, with a huskiness more terrible than a screaming, and I trembled as I listened. "As I says, how's pictures set you thinking? Do you know, young sir? I'm right sot on it. This on here. Right, I got this book off Eb. I used to look at it a lot, especially when I'd hear passing Clark's rant on Sundays in a big wig. Once I tried something funny here, young sir. Don't get skirt. All I done was to look at the picture afore I killed the sheep for market. The tone of the old man now sank very low, sometimes becoming so faint that his words were hardly audible. I listened to the rain, and to a rattling of the bleared, small-paned windows, and marked a rumbling of approaching thunder quite unusual for the season. Once a terrific flash, and peal shook the frail house to its foundation, but the whisperer seemed not to notice it. The interruption was not produced by my fright, nor by my rapidly increasing storm, amidst whose fury I was presently to open my eyes on a smoky solitude of blackened ruins. It was produced by a very simple, though somewhat unusual happening. The open book lay between us, with the pictures staring repulsively upwards. As the old man whispered the words more the same, tiny splattering impact was heard, and something showed on the yellow paper of the upturned volume, as though the rain or the leaky roof, but rain was not red. The butcher shop on the Anzique cannibals, small red spattering glistened picturesquely, leading vividness to the horror of the engraving. The old man saw it, and stopped whispering, even before my expression of horror made it necessary. Saw it, and glanced quickly upwards to the floor of the room he had left an hour before. I followed his glance, and beheld just above us on the loose plaster of an ancient ceiling a large irregular spot of wet crimson which seemed to spread even as I viewed it. I did not shriek or move, but I merely shut my eyes. A moment later came a titanic thunderbolt of thunderbolts, blistering that accursed house of unutterable secrets and bringing the oblivion which alone saved my mind.